That's what's going on right now in the nutrition industry. And if you're not paranoid, you better watch your back because new innovation is going to catch up.
All right, today's guest is the founder of the world-leading low-carb, high-fat nutrition company that supports endurance performance, SFuels. My guest comes from a long history of healthcare professionals in his family, and he himself studied naturopathic medicine and computer science, and he has an entrepreneurial mindset. While training for triathlon and ultra-endurance events, he found that the market for fueling drinks and bars was just full of sugar and syrups and refined grains. And so with his nutrition background and his ultra-endurance racing experience, he knew that he could create something better. So after many years of product development, SFuels was born. SFuels was developed with sports physiologist and world-renowned coach Dr. Dan Plews, ultramarathon world record holder Zach Bitter, and Olympic triathlon medalist Hayden Wilde, and many other world-class endurance experts. I'm looking forward to this discussion about how we can optimize our fueling in training and racing and why SFuels was developed and just understand his journey from idea to marketplace. So it's an enormous honor and privilege to have him today. So welcome to the show, Leighton Phillips. How are you, mate?
Hey, Greg. Good to talk to you. It's just awesome to catch up. You were kind of one of those athletes that I was looking at on the front page of Triathlete magazine when we were both that kind of age back in Australia. But just looking at the folks you've had on your show, it's just humbled to be here, buddy. So thanks for having us on.
Oh, thanks, mate. You're aging us both talking about magazine covers. I think we're going back 20, 25 years now. But look, where in the world are you chatting to me from?
Yeah, we're in Raleigh in North Carolina.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
We've been here for, I guess, 5 years. And prior to that, we were in Hong Kong.
Nice. So it's another Aussie living abroad. But Listen, mate, we were introduced by our good friend, Dr. Dan Plews, who's been on this show numerous times. And I was just fascinated by your story, your entrepreneurial mindset, and of course, the company you developed, SFuels. So I kind of want to look at this episode where we might discuss a bit about your journey and then understanding kind of your entrepreneurial mindset. But then I also want to sort of break down, why SFuels and discuss fueling for endurance sports, both in training and in racing. Sound good to you?
Great.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well, let's jump right in because there's a lot to cover. Let's start by, rewinding the clock, as I love to say in the show. When did your passion for nutrition and sport and all of that develop?
I think Dad had a lot of influence. His, health background. He was a pathologist. He would take us into the pathology area and show us the tissues and kind of try to point that that's something to do with bad diet. And this was like 40, 50 years ago. And as a kid, you'd kind of laugh it off. But he was also a Olympic trivia nut. And like he would go to Europe and then while he's there on holiday, he would just ring up Emil Zatopek for a chat.
Get out.
So it was this kind of like, anyway, he would take us to the track. When I still remember, I would have been 5 or 6 years old, and Dad would take us to the track, and he'd have his chrome stopwatch, and he'd do timed intervals. And I just feel like, that. And then as I got into 10 or 11, 12, he took me to my first naturopathic kind of conference, which was one of the godfathers, a guy called Bernard Jensen, who was out of California, and he was in Australia. And I think that's where it all began. There's just that background, Greg.
Emil Zatopek, are you kidding me? Did he actually connect with him?
Oh, yeah. No, he sat on the phone for an hour and they chatted about, obviously just an incredible range of performance with Emil. That's what Dad was double clicking on, just the impressiveness of that range. So
just in case listeners don't know Emil Zatopek, he won the 5, the 10 and the marathon in the one Olympics. Was it the 52 Olympic? What was it?
I was going to say it was either Mexico or somewhere around that.
It wasn't Melbourne, which was 56.
Yeah.
Anyway, somebody can tell me. Somebody will write in and tell me.
I'm sure my dad will tell you.
Yeah, there we go. I just think that's fascinating that, you have that kind of background where obviously sport is a big focus for the family, but then you're looking at naturopathic medicine as well, which honestly 30, 40 years ago is still a bit woo-woo, right? I mean, did you grow up with that kind of natural medicine in your family?
Yeah, well, I would say, there's this whole kind of, I would say, gradient, naturopathic medicine, chiropractic, osteopathic medicine is very kind of closely related, and just a long lineage of chiropractic in our family. The first chiropractors of New Zealand were from our family, and it kind of grew from there, I guess. And yeah, I went and studied that for 6 years in Australia and practiced for several years, and just a lot of, I guess, major focus on kind of the relationship between gut health and systemic health. And back then, words like microbiome and all that kind of stuff were just were never even invented at that point. So I felt like at the point we studied it, it was like the empirical observations in clinical practice were ahead of the science.
Yeah, right. It hadn't been backed up, but there was a gut instinct.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so did you end up, when you left school, was it always a focus to go into that? Or, I read in the introduction, you have the computer science degree, but you also have the naturopathic medicine. So were you conflicted which way to go, or what was that about?
Well, actually, no. I wanted to go just all in naturopathic medicine. I think Dad and his wisdom just, like at the point, like you just said, it was still a fragile and probably truly an alternate form of science. And, so, and at the time too, technology was just in the spirit of like personal technology. It was still forthcoming. So he kind of put me on that route. And I think that's kind of, created a living, of which then I went and studied naturopathic medicine after and practiced after. But it's probably the tech industry that's giving the funding to underwrite my wife leads the general management of SFuels. And it's been a good, I think I couldn't question what the guidance Dad gave me at the time. I felt like, no, I want to go all in on the other, but
it makes sense.
Better guidance.
Were you always an athlete? Were you always, was triathlon and running, was that in your blood throughout that whole time?
Look, I state title level kind of swimmer through primary school, got into track and cross country at high school, went to state titles, kind of that level again. And then it was in probably the last 3 years of high school that I got introduced to triathlon. And because I had the swimming, running, I just had to learn how to ride a bike. And it wasn't pretty, but I loved beating Miles Stewart out of the water. I need to be smacked on the bike, but I could run a good finish of the race.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I don't know if that's a big deal to beat Miles Stewart out of the water. Everybody did that, didn't they? No, I'm just kidding.
But yeah, he and his dad were based down there on the Gold Coast, and I was in Brisbane. And we didn't have a lot of relationship. I was training with the Brisbane crew, but we certainly raced together. And he was pretty much one of the more leading athletes of the time.
So were you around when guys like Andrew Johns was in Brisbane and Chris Hill? They all come out of Brisbane, right?
Yeah, that was Craig Maskill and these guys. And I did a lot of training with them. We went to the same high school. So yeah, there was just, I think, a strong, I would say, cross country in the winter, swimming in the summer kind of group. And then we triathlon, because triathlon still then there wasn't a lot of races around, right? So yeah.
I love that. And when did this sort of mindset to entrepreneurial type work kick in? Was it while you were in the tech industry? Were you building companies in tech?
We were building products, certainly.
Yeah.
And that was both wireless technologies and mobile computing technologies and what have you. I've always had a very curious mind, love to frontier, like untested areas, and the question of what's possible, I guess. Outperforming incumbents, these kind of things attracts me to, like, it energizes me. And I guess I put all of that over this kind of denominator of naturopathic medicine. And I felt like, where do these fuse? I wouldn't say I went out looking for it. I felt like it really came together later in life when we were in Hong Kong, to be honest, when I was doing a bunch of ultra running.
Yeah, right. And you were studying, why is that when you kind of, studying your naturopathic medicine?
No, I studied, what is that? You tested me 89 to 96, I think it was, on 1990 to 96, I think it was. And then where it really came together for me to think, there's a market gap here. And I had conviction that the way that things were being approached, that there was plenty of opportunity for innovation. And there still is, quite frankly. And that would be like 15 years later.
Yeah, right. And so when did it all come about? Let's fast forward a little bit. You know, you've culminated your love for sport, your entrepreneurial mindset, your love for nutrition and, you know, natural medicine. You've obviously got the tech background. Did that all culminate in was there one moment where you were like, okay, I've got to start a company here?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say at first it was just out of the kind of a bolt from the sky of starting a company. I was in Hong Kong. There's a big trail running community. It's basically the number one sport in Hong Kong. And I was getting this kind of a 4 or 5 hour trail, and it's up and down Hong Kong, as you probably know. You're either up or down. 4 or 5 hours. It'd probably be 4,000 feet of climbing, and you'd come back and fingers and feet and head would be swollen, and to the point where I had to start taking meds. And for a while, I felt like I wasn't questioning that. And then it would be, I think, 3 months later before I realized, what am I doing? And I really started double clicking on what's going on here. And at the time, I mean, I've always read medical research papers as like just a passion on the side, even though I wasn't practicing. And I stumbled into this kind of what Tim Noakes and what Scott Volek and Steve Finney were starting to talk about low carbohydrate. And for me, it was nothing to do with performance, even though that's what how they were looking at it. I was looking at it from inflammatory load. And I just started testing myself on the trails with totally homemade things. And I really started noticing changes, you know, within weeks. So that's where I felt like there's something here, and I needed to do, a lot more kind of research on this to work out whether I had conviction in this. But that's where it started, Greg.
So what year was that? How long ago was that now?
So that was 2016. I did my first off season in trail running, where I stopped classic off the shelf, heavy scented carb fueling. And even my diet was like, we all grew up in the carb era, right?
Carbo parties, mate. Yeah.
It was almost like a badge of honor that who could do the most pasta at Sizzler. It was kind of a proxy for your training.
And the cheesy bread that goes with it.
Right. So anyway, I started testing back then in 2016 period. I did 3 months work, and then I started talking to some labs in the US. I don't know, have you heard of this race series called Racing the Planet?
I've heard of that, yes.
Yeah, yes. They're quite large now. They run 4 races in deserts around the world, the Atacama, Chile, Gobi, and the Antarctic. It's a 6-day, 250K race. The CEO of that, I got to know quite well. We did the race, but we got to know them also, but she really kind of mentored me on, if you're going to do something, anything to do with food, you probably don't want to manufacture that at this point in time in Hong Kong or China. And she really kind of guided me to, you really want to develop that in the US. And that's kind of where we reached out to labs in California.
Classic. And so I mentioned Dr. Dan Plews at the top of the show. You knew Dan before all of this, and were you guys working together on this, or did you bring him on later?
No, we weren't together at that point. We developed firstly a bar product, and it's kind of funny. We gave out, 4,000 samples to a bunch of runners around the world, a lot in the US actually, but the best advice I got was from my kids, like totally, it might sound a pun, non-sugar-coated, very direct feedback on our product. and that was for a good year and a half. It took us 17 iterations to get two seasons we had to go through, because how you were fusing the ingredients on a product like this, on how it would perform in the winter and the summer, were very different. So we had to go through 2 seasons. And 2 yearly full seasons, if you will.
Yeah.
And then it was really, so that was 2017. And then it was, when Dan connected with us, he had been low carb, but kind of, again, self-creating fuel. And he felt like there's a gap and I'd love to talk to you. And we started chatting, and he said about going after the world championship. Now, I thought at the time he just meant, yeah, I'm just going to go and compete. And then within about 3 weeks, I realized the guy's talking about winning the thing as an age grouper.
Yeah.
And it was kind of funny because the development we then worked on together, which was our training product, we didn't. Bob Babbitt was the most insightful on this, on calling us out and saying, you're probably the first nutrition company I've ever seen that started with the training product before a racing product. And that lends itself to the nuance of what we're building in SFuels. And Dan helped us build that training product, and that's what he went into the Kona world record performance in 2018 using.
That was an insane performance. I can't remember the exact time. Forgive me. I think it was 8:18 or something, or whatever it was.
Yeah, he did 8:24.
8:24. I'm giving him 6 minutes, but I think he was. That was one of those where everybody stood up and took notice. And then obviously we've watched the athletes that he's been training, most recently, Chelsea Sodaro, and he's taken on Sam Long and Javier Gomez, and his list goes on, Terenzo Bozzoni before that. He's got, and then his background, obviously, with all the other sports that he's worked with. Fascinating guy. And when I heard that you guys were connected and building this product, I just thought, you know what, I've got to have you on the show because I really want to dissect what this product is and how it came about. So let's keep doing that. You mentioned your wife earlier. She's the GM. What was her background that, the two of you were able to build this together?
Yeah, she had 15 years at Nestle. And she was on the executive at Nestle. And the great thing about these big companies, food tech or any of these companies, is that you can have 5 careers in one company, right? So she had exposure from mergers and acquisitions to product development to sales and marketing. So the funny thing was, though, Greg, was that when she was working at Nestle, and then we had 2 boys, and then she came back to working, and then we started SFuels. But in that time was when the whole digital marketing, social marketing happened. So her actual education training was in marketing. Well, the history of marketing and what it was after we had the kids were two totally
different things. And so changing so quick.
Yeah.
Jeez. Yeah. But I love the fact that the two of you are able to build this company together. How is it working together?
Yeah, I think our skills are very discrete in a sense. She has just really solid operational management expertise for this kind of business. You're talking about fast-moving consumer goods, understanding the channel strategy, distribution strategy. It's really only now that whole experience and drawing on that will be helpful. We've done a lot of work as a direct-to-consumer to really prove that the product stands on its own 2 feet. And just now with Bob Babbitt and some of the other folks that we're bringing on, we're now getting into distribution. Well, that's where her real, background kicks in. And mine has been more on the product development side and on obviously just the nutritional formulation side.
Perfect.
But I think, honestly, we've probably bought in between Dan Plews, Dave Scott, Bob, Zach Bitter, Hayden. They've all bought in pieces of expertise that you'll never have yourself, So we just continue to try to surround ourselves with smartest people we can find.
I love that. And when you're looking at the marketplace right now of nutrition companies, where are you seeing the gaps? Obviously, are there other low-carb nutrition products out there that aren't doing a very good job? Or when you pulled the trigger to do this, you've obviously done some homework. Is this an area that you just really felt needed some work? And to your point, you said we wanted to focus on the training before we focus on the racing. Is that how you kind of looked at it?
Yeah, I think so. I had this quite overwhelming sense that there was actually not a big incentive for the industry to change because they were so vested in the sugar carbohydrate model that it was very hard to back out when your cash cow is so dependent on that.
Yeah. And
that's both a training and racing product situation for pick your top 5, fueling companies. There absolutely has been some attempts in the last, 5 to 8 years of low carb products, but we felt like, again, you don't have to be a rocket science here. You just look at the social media kind of feedback on texture and taste, and we felt like we could do better. You know, it's a big market. There's plenty of opportunity to innovate. You know, take a company like Apple. What they do really well at is they're prepared to cannibalize their best product to create a better product. Not many companies are up for that. Most companies will protect their cash cow at all costs, to the point where future science can suggest another approach could be optimal, but they're so vested. And I felt like that's exactly what I was seeing here. And between Nicole's background and my background, I felt we could solve for this. And
so when did you go, you know, take me through the time period from going the idea through to marketplace. When did you had that first idea in Hong Kong? How long and what was that process like?
First product was a couple of years, couple of seasons. And even that, we had it on the market for 6 months and I pulled it off the market. And then 2018 was the first fluid, like the train formula. And that took 6 to 9 months to get that to market. So in 2 to 3 years.
That's pretty quick, I would say, no?
Yeah, for
now looking back and looking from the outside in, it seems quick in terms of timeline.
It's kind of funny, like like you look back and you kick yourself so hard for making all these mistakes, right? But I think every mistake is just an opportunity to bank learning that tribal knowledge it is the IP. Like you can go and formally put patents and IP and all that stuff. That is really hard to police and protect. But the tribal knowledge you learn in a company of what works and what doesn't, that's the gold. And you got to keep that pretty close to your chest.
I love that. And you talk about some of the lessons you've learned. What have been some of the low experiences of this, and what have been some of the highs?
You know, I think for a lot, whether it's sport or whether it's business, I think we probably get a little too caught up in the finish line. Like we have this vision that the finish line is going to satisfy the heart. And I feel like so many times, like I remember this race in the Racing the Planet race it was on the border of Vietnam and China. And they actually, after 6 days, they actually missed my finish of the whole race on a photo. But you know what? I wouldn't trade that photo for probably, I've got 100 photos of running through the tribes and the people and the culture and the scenery and the foods of that part of the countryside. And I feel like in business or in sport, if you're not like just really mesmerized by that experience of getting to the finish line, you're probably going to be disappointed when you get there, because it's such a small slither of the total experience, the finish line.
Oh, it's so well said, mate. I love that. And it's like people that have listened to this show will often hear me say, look, it's about the process and the journey far more than the destination. And, you know, my personal one, I remember going into the 2004 Olympics and I'd been injured, but for about 8 weeks, Laura and I just trained together every single day, and we had such purpose and we were just so intent every single day. And yeah, I went to the Olympics and my mindset, you know, I look back and there's a lot of things I could have done different. I think I didn't understand the power of the mind at that point, and I went in underconfident, and that definitely cost me a medal. But I look back and I think, I don't even remember the Olympics itself,
right.
But that 8 to 10 weeks, specifically that journey that Laura and I did, where she'd go up the road on the bike and I'd chase her down, and she was amazing, and it made our relationship stronger, but it was also such a special journey, you know?
I was just, I was listening to your Cameron Brown interview you did some time back, and like he was a good friend of mine. I just congratulated him the other day on his finish of his career, and he said the same on your show, and I wasn't kind of looking for it, just came up in the show, and I said, well, there you go, right? It's very consistent. We did this, you probably heard of this Ultra Trail Mont Blanc UTMB race it goes through 3 countries there in Europe, and there was a point there in 2016, 125 kilometers in, you'd already done 8,000 meters of vertical ascent, and you come out of the forest. I was hallucinating and my family was at the aid station. And if it wasn't, I think, for them there to kind of bring me back to the purpose, it was nothing to do with racing, it was all to do with finishing, that I never would have finished. So I just feel like, again, experiences and wrapping friends and family around that experience is what's going to really kind of see you through. And I think that's what's valuable to me looking backwards.
Gosh, you're leaning into one of my favorite topics, by the way. I really enjoy these conversations of understanding why you're doing something, what's your purpose, and understanding the joy is in the journey. I'm a little bit taken aback by all of these amazing ultra events that you've done. You're talking to somebody that really specialized in Olympic distance triathlon and did a couple of Ironmans, but really that wasn't my forte. How many of these ultra events have you done?
I think I've done maybe 600K. You had to do 300K races just to get into the barrel, or the, what do you call it, the lottery, to get a choice, get a show at UTMB. So I think I've done 6 100s. I may have done another that many 50s, a few 50 milers, and then the Racing the Planet was 250K. But all of those are like really heavy elevation, so they're not flat. Like Zach Bitter.
Yeah.
I was just with him 2 weeks ago, and we were on this Catalina Island. We sponsored a race there with Bob Babbitt and the folks there, and I'm trying to get Zach to like, oh, you got to get into this kind of elevation trail running. But the guys are just a legend and a speed demon on the track doing 100-mile. I think that'd drive me nuts.
Yeah.
But there's something magical about running through the night and through 3 countries and over all this elevation. It is just an awesome experience. I love that.
Are you self-experimenting with every product? Are you still doing these runs? Are you still and are you self-experimenting with everything you make?
Yeah, we do. The level of experimentation, of course, now is much broader and more structured than it was at the start. But I still absolutely do. And a lot of it, is, you would well know, is that it's one thing for a product to feel good, taste good when you're sitting on a couch. But when you're 6 hours into a ride or a run, how that thing tastes and texture can be totally upside down.
Totally. You just want a beer and pretzels or just anything else.
The bad news about that is there's no shortcut. You got to do the first 5 hours before you get into the lab.
Oh, seriously. Yeah. Who are the guinea pigs? Who have we got now?
No, your friends kind of disappear after about 30K, you know?
A quick mini break to tell you about Any Question, the place where you can go ask world-leading experts questions, and you can already look at a lot of their answers that they've already created. People like Dr. Dan Plews are already on there answering questions. We talk about Dr. Dan Plews in this episode. He's worked a lot with SFuels and Leighton Phillips, and so that's a great place. If you are curious about SFuels, go ask Dr. Dan Plews some questions about it and see how it's impacted both his career as an athlete and also the athletes that he coaches. So go check it out. Any Question, it's free. Go download it on iOS or Android, or you can go onto the web and you can find it there. That's anyquestion.com, and you can use anyquestion.com/Greg Bennett. Go check it out. Cheers. SFuels is a brand. Tell me, how did you come up with the name, and how has that all been? When we talk about why SFuels, you've talked about having the inflammation in your feet and everything when you've been doing these ultras, but why SFuels specifically? And then tell me a little bit about the brand itself.
I think Nicole put the first company registration down as Spike Free Limited, and it actually was registered in Hong Kong.
Spike Free. Got it. Yeah.
We got this, again, we both had a lot of marketing background, but apparently we were still no good at it. So we got advice on this doesn't work. But the basis of it was, and the SF in SFuels was referring to our still to this day, the basis of every product we look at the way in which it reacts to blood sugars and insulin, because we're so interested in fat oxidation and substrate oxidation efficiency. So we were doing the classic, when you would go into a medical clinical environment today and they were to test you for prediabetes or diabetes, they would test you through a glucose tolerance, fasting glucose tolerance test. And that's how we would test our products. And we would see that when you take a product, when you're just doing no exercise, how does it react in the blood sugars? And that's where the genesis of the SF, it's not San Francisco, it's not sugar-free. It's about, we were trying to really minimize and mitigate how this thing would react in the body with blood sugars and insulin.
And so that's where the SFuels is all about. So you've kept Spike, but you took out the whole word and just went SFuels. I love the name, actually. I think it resonates. I think a lot of people are probably going, well, what's the S? We get the fuels. You know, what are we talking about here? And I think my first thing was maybe it was sugar, but then I'm like, hang on, we don't want sugar fueling. That's not the point of this product. But it's not easy. So
it kind of works in the spirit of people just ask the question.
Yeah, exactly.
And we have the opportunity to tell the story, right?
Exactly. And then you sort of, when you first, did Dan reach out to you? Did you mention that? Or did you reach out to him originally to work?
He has a recollection of me reaching out to him, and I kind of think it was the opposite. But it was both of us kind of. I was looking for, hey, we have this idea. We'd done the bar, it wasn't good enough. We were tinkering with a fluid, and we needed to start really testing it for validity in a field test, meaning like a race. And that's when really we kind of stumbled with Dan. And honestly, he would say himself that his whole professional platform really grew off the back of his result there in Kona. And I would say that SFuels really established, where we're here to play on the back of what Dan did in Kona also. So we have a very close relationship. And when we went there to Kona and we were, obviously behind Dan the whole way through the day, Dave Scott heard about us, and his agency called us and said, hey, I've been with a nutrition company, like a much bigger nutrition company. He came and had breakfast with us, and then he wanted to join the company. And, in the early parts of the company, I think Dave was a great mentor in a number of areas. So we've been very fortunate, Greg.
Well, when you mention those names in the world of triathlon, when Dave Scott, I've referred to him as the godfather of the sport. People want to talk about who's the greatest athlete of all time, and they love to throw names in there. But I almost put Dave above that. And just say, no, he's not in that conversation because he's above that. He's the godfather. He's the reason we have a sport.
Definitely an aura there.
Yeah, there is, isn't it? For you and I, we're of similar age, growing up in the 80s and early 90s with the sport. Dave Scott was it, along with Mark Allen. And so to have him on your team. And then we've talked a bit about Zach Bitter. Has he been a good person for you are these guys willing to experiment when you come up with new products? Are they willing to try things, or does it affect their training too much?
Oh, no, totally on the basis of I think they're tired of self-experimenting. They want to, add some formality and structure and real science to it all. We put a lot of athletes' numbers, meaning lab numbers, over Dan's race data. And we were firstly, just trying to get a sense for, we could predict, and we got quite accurate when people would hit the wall based on if they were to use their metabolic efficiency at Dan's race pace in Hawaii, what would happen. And when we started talking to Zach about this on the 100-mile side of things, at the time, he had just set the world record on the track for 100 miles, 11 hours plus. Jeez. And then COVID came along and shut all the racing down, of course. And then he was going to do 100-mile world record on a treadmill, and he was going to do it at the local, gym. And I said, well, hey, we're living in the world of social media and have you. What if I bought, if you will, the media platform to your house, and we got Nordic Track to put to a treadmill so that there was a failover capability, and then we would broadcast that out. Yeah. And we had 35,000 people watching Zach set the world record for 100-mile on the treadmill, which was, sub 7-minute miles for, 12 hours plus. And that was the first real race proof point of our racing product. Yeah. So it's kind of funny how these things kind of come together, but yeah.
I'm just picturing running 100 miles with the two. I have my own stories of, doing crazy things on treadmills, and I always had the second one, next to it on the side, because the first one you'd be on would be covered in sweat and would get slippery. And so I used to I'd keep it, jump from one to the other just so I'd have a dry treadmill. But 100 miles, sub 7-minute mile pace.
Well, it's funny you say that, because, we realized during the day and within the first 30 minutes, and this was going to be a 12-hour plus day, in the first 30 minutes, the house power was not set up well to run these two treadmills. And what would happen is one would fail, and he had to immediately jump to the next one. It was one of the most stressful days of my life. And
something you thought could be a bit of fun, get the product out there, get the message. Suddenly you're like,
totally. Anyway, like a year later, kind of racing started, 2021 racing started to come back. He went on to then win the 100-mile road championship, the US ATF 100-mile road championship here in the US. Yeah. Again, it was another proof point of our racing product. So,
well, what about then skipping forward to Hayden Wilde, who honestly, if you want to listen to a great episode, I am such a fan of Hayden Wilde after having him on the show. I was a fan before, but
he's a character.
Not just a character, he's a good human being. He's somebody that I'm like, okay, if I was in the trenches, I'd want to be in the trenches with Hayden Wilde. He's a good person. I really like that guy.
And with Hayden, so we had kind of an Ironman proof point, and we had this 100-mile proof point, and we then wanted to say, well, is this valid for high intensity, shorter duration? And it was just so happening that our marketing agency was in New Zealand. The guy that runs that was an Xterra world champion, and he had a great long relationship with Hayden. He said, you've got to talk to Hayden. So we connected, and this was, Hayden hadn't started at Super League yet. Obviously, the Olympics hadn't happened.
Oh, this is years, 2018 or something.
So this was like 2020, 2021, that kind of period.
Yeah.
So we said, hey, Hayden, we'll engage, and we'll sponsor and we'll test. And we had him work with Dan in the labs, and with his coach do some optimizations. But in that period of time, we had a 2-year contract with Hayden that Super League, Olympics, an Xterra World Championship. It was just and he actually helped us translate what was a racing drink product into a gel product. He was really the guinea pig, you'd say, on how to actually translate this into a gel. And it's fascinating. We actually created like a powder product that you would mix with water to the concentration relative to your metabolism for your racing. So it was a very customized way to do a gel product.
Wow.
Hayden was really the middle of that.
And what kind of improvements did you see when you were working with all of these athletes? I mean, you've worked with so many of the best of the best. What were you measuring, and what kind of improvements were you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, then this is the real ongoing relationship with Dan is both athletic testing in the labs, which was predominantly hooking up to a metabolic cart and really looking at substrate efficiency at different intensities, and then running and biking efficiency. So we would effectively do a VO2 max, and based on the exchange of, carbon dioxide out and oxygen in, you could calculate fat and carbohydrate oxidation efficiency. And you would assume that because you're a pro athlete and because you're doing, 20, 30 hours a week, it would naturally be good. And we had athletes coming in, without naming names, that had, a 0.5 gram per minute of fat oxidation. And then through manipulation, we've turned that into 1.8 grams per minute of fat oxidation. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that, and by the way, in that same period of changing that fat oxidation of improvement, we went from 165 watts on the bike to 300 watts on the bike. So,
wow.
And this is where it actually starts really testing some of what has been, if you will, textbook literature on what should happen in metabolism at certain intensities. But through this manipulation, Dan's work, and we feel diet and our products, that we can see these dramatic changes. And at the end of the day, what it means is I can burn fat for most of that race and preserve that glycogen to when it matters at the end. And if I am taking in, and they all absolutely still take in carbohydrate, but I don't need to take in anywhere as much to put me into high risk GI distress cases. So that's kind of how the mechanics of it work. There is Dan is such an expert. He looks at also, you can still have athletes that may have good oxidation of fat and carbohydrate, and then they burn a lot of both. So they're in effect inefficient in that they take a lot of energy to deliver a certain amount of power on the bike or on running. So he can also look at manipulation to how do you still deliver that intensity and performance yet at a lower substrate performance level, and that means you're improving the efficiency. So in the case of Matt Kerr, so he was an age grouper, 10.5-hour Ironman. He just got his pro card at the end of last year. He placed 5th at Taupo for his first pro race up against Braden and the team there. He's now gone from a 10:30 to a sub 8:30. He won at Utah last year, the World Championship age group in sub 8:30. He's running sub 3s. And if you look at his splits, if you look at Dan's splits on that marathon leg, there's not a lot of difference kilometer to kilometer through the whole 42 kilometers.
That's amazing. Where were you guys in 2012 when I did a couple of Ironmans when I turned 40? My goodness, I was all over the place. I was spiking and then crashing and spiking and crashing. And I was like, oh my God, it was a hell of a time. But I was on your website earlier, and you're very much about right fuel, right time. What do you mean by that when you've kind of got that plastered everywhere?
The reason why I said earlier, and Bob made this kind of this kind of comment about creating a training product first, is because when we were all training, and still to this day, we train different forms of training to exacerbate the adaptation of the body to either strength or high intensity of VO2 max or threshold or lactate or aerobic capacity, joint mobility, range of movement, like all of these things. And you do different things to strain and trigger the body to adapt to those stresses. And at those different intensities between, say, zone 2 aerobic, and then you move up through, if you were using the RPE scale, you go to, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, you get to zone 4 and 5. The body is using very different substrates, and the type of fuel that it naturally uses is different at these different intensities. So that's the right fuel side of it. Using the right fuel to really stress and test the body to build capability in these very different energy systems. In a zone 2 intensity, I should be mostly burning fat. But I can train the body so that I can get into typically what for a lot of people would be zone 4 and still burning mostly fat. In fact, there was a paper there just in January that was published, because one of I would say the past 15 years suggestion of lower carb training is that you'll lose your top end.
That's how I felt when I was doing a little bit towards the end of my career, in fairness. Like I kind of felt like I could do 5-6 hour bike rides in the mountains just on water and some electrolytes. But then the next day when I wanted to do hard 3-minute efforts, it was like the body's like, no, you're not going there. I was like, I'm stuck.
There's two things here. One is the study that just came out was showing they basically did they reversed 2 groups, et cetera, across low carb and high carb, but they ran them at 85% of VO2 max of 800 repeats and mile, like really high intensity stuff. It's not your classic fat testing protocol. But what they were showing is under the protocol that they were advising that they could still deliver the same performance levels as the high carb athletes. And that was at 85% of the VO2 max. Now, part of this comes back to, and Dan talks about, having the specific adaptation to the target of the intensity of either the racing or the training that you're doing. And we find a lot that, there's a lot of aerobic work that always has to happen in endurance sport, but you can't take your foot off both training the intensity of the body in a physical sense, meaning, interval work, tempo work, or what have you. At the same time, when you're doing that, the body is going to be using carbohydrate. So you have to, at that time, use carbohydrate. And it's not about one or the other. It's about exploiting both. And when you do the math on this, you can see the magic happens when you really can exploit both energy systems at these different intensities.
Yeah. Well said, by the way. I'm fascinated by all of it. You've spoken a lot about training and racing. How much do you focus on sort of the daily lives? And if we have listeners there that are saying, well, I don't, I'm not a high performance athlete. I train, I enjoy my, my weekend race every so often, but it's more my day-to-day nutrition, my day-to-day meals. Do you look at that and combine that with training and racing?
Yeah, the product development, like I said earlier, it started with training. We then naturally had to have a racing product, but we always believed that in time and ultimately the portfolio overall at SFuels will probably, the largest part of the portfolio will probably be in the day-to-day side. And part of the belief of that, and actually we had, I think, a point of view on this again before the science came out, but there was a group of researchers that looked at 434 athletes and their substrate lab data. And the two most determinant factors on improving fat oxidation was the frequency of long duration sessions. So classic, what we used to call LSD, right? And then the second was diet and fueling. And particularly with diet and fueling, it was the fat versus carbohydrate content. So we developed a number of products that were really trying to simplify, if you will, the everyday application of a higher fat, lower carb dietetic construct, whether that was a shake or pancakes, or it was a recovery, drink, or a caffeinated beverage, or a, snackable bar. It needs to be easy if the compliance is to be high, right? And that's why we started building these products. We don't use any fructose, sugar alcohols, very selective. We actually developed a specific fat compound, and this is right through the products.
In endurance sports, you've been there yourself. I feel like at the finishing line, it's like every second or third person is talking about they had gut cramps and gut pain and bloated. And what are you looking at? Is that all due to carbohydrates and sugar, or what's affecting the gut, and what do you use to help people ease their gut?
It's not all the compounds. Like you're talking about a situation. We wrote a paper on this. In fact, it's the most downloaded paper on our website. It's called the Ultra Gut. And the paper basically talks about the environment that creates the number one reason for not finishing these races, and that is gut distress.
Yeah.
And that's coming out of that's not our literature. That's coming out of, whether it's sports med research that happens at Ironman.
You just got to be at a finishing line, mate. It doesn't take much.
Right,
it's like
exactly.
It really is so many.
But, what the environment is, of course, is that firstly, you're shunting most of your blood supply away from the gut to the working muscles, point one. Point two is you're generally at a state of dehydration, like a level of gradual dehydration. And then thirdly, and this has been most prominent over the past 25 years, very high fructose coming into the diet during the race that is much higher than was used in training. And then the last one, which there is, I would say there is, I don't think the science is complete on this because there's variance between how athletes react, but caffeine for some can be a causative factor. So when we say fructose, it's, remember that 50% of table sugar or sucrose is fructose. So it's not just about discrete fructose in these products, but when you start seeing this idea of, training the gut with sucrose and fructose in order to be able to take 90 to 150 grams of carbohydrates per hour, you kind of really start questioning, hey, the reason why your gut is reacting is because it's basically saying that this is not what we should be taking into the body, this kind of concentration.
Get it out, help.
Yeah. And it's funny because, that's kind of like almost like what would you say? Like a conceptual observation, but in studies, again, there's this one in January that got published where they were showing that in the high carb group, in only 4 weeks, there was evidence of 30% of the participants having what we would clinically call prediabetes. And that was a resting blood glucose level of over 100 millimole, because they were using CGM, constant monitoring of the blood sugar. And they were seeing that these athletes were mostly pre-diabetic on that type of routine. So, there is the real gut effect of taking just these very high doses. And then there is the complication and more chronic situation of that. And remember that this is a lifestyle. This is not we do a race and we hang up the boots and we go. People love to do this until the day they've finished.
Yeah.
They love this.
Yeah. Do you look at electrolytes and mineral replacement in your products as well?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the training product and the racing product has got your classic spread of minerals. So absolutely we do. It's kind of funny because the train product, without just calling the product out itself, but if you just look at it from a caloric perspective, you'll probably look at it sideways and say, how the dickens will this thing fuel me? Because there's only like 50 calories in a serve. Well, that's exactly the type of fat we're using. And what we're trying to do is hydrate, give the electrolytes, and give a fat that will trigger the enzymes to switch on to oxidize fat. So this is, when we say it's train, it's not train in the spirit of it's just giving you the calories to train. It's trying to train the metabolism for you to burn fat better.
I love that. Mate, you've educated me. I'm sitting here going, should I make a comeback? now that I know I could fuel better, and I'm just, that's absolute jest, everybody. I'm running maybe 5K a morning at the moment, and the idea of doing a whole lot more, I think, would be brutal. But I love the idea of what you're doing. What have you got, in store for the future? You mentioned that daily products. You've done training. You're doing racing. Your website is full of useful information on how to use your products, when and where, and what's next for you?
I think there's still, again, the science is still catching up to understand the role of nutrients to how it affects heart rate variability. I think if that is the proxy for really understanding how the body is recovering, parasympathetic versus sympathetic nervous system, we know absolutely that there are nutrients that can throttle this one way or the other. If you take a lot of caffeine, it will further exacerbate the problem. There are other, even again, a lot of specific gut nutrients, which are really breakthrough nutritional research going on to how that can impact HRV. We wrote this paper and I got a number of our ambassadors to test this for me to make sure that we weren't dreaming this up. But we got them to do a test of, hey, do your standard training routine, but one night take alcohol and then the next 2 nights take chamomile tea and come back to us with your HRV data. And we were just showing all of them, they self-realized themselves how a single drink of something that could negatively or positively affect HRV was very real.
Wow.
The other area that we think it's kind of, again, very much the case of sport and application is ahead of the understanding of science to what exactly is happening and how it's working. That's with respect to specific types of ketones, particularly the ester. And we know quite well, and the research is way more sound on the role of ketones for rapid muscle tissue recovery, like accelerated, like that's, you can connect the dots and reproduce the results quite effectively with that. When you see, though, most of the Tour de France teams throwing out ketone ester bottles, halfway into a stage, they know something that yet the science labs haven't yet connected the dots. The fact they're all doing it would tell you that they're the most tested endurance athletes in terms of subsegments of endurance sport. and they know something. And we're very engaged into this discussion. We've seen what it can do in military applications, and I think there's going to be just some awesome innovation opportunity between what's going on there and what we're doing in SFuels.
Wow. So you've got a lot of expansion in mind here. I mean, you've got the training, you've got the racing, you're starting to build out the daily diet, you're looking into nutrition for HRV, you're researching, how ketones can be implemented. It's a fascinating time to be in this kind of a marketplace. When
you have incumbents that can really extract literally billions of dollars on a given model, the incentive to change is really challenging. Like it's tough to innovate around that if it's going to affect that, because it's whole companies and families that are running off the back of this. So it's really hard to change. So I think what's exciting for us is that we don't have that legacy. We're not attached to that. We can really innovate and adopt and embrace new ideas, and some of them will work and some of them will crash and burn, and that's okay.
You can pivot quickly. You're small enough to pivot, and it's you've read that book, I'm sure. It's one of the world leading books. Is Who Moved My Cheese? Do you know that one?
Right.
Yeah.
Right,
it's that. It's exactly what you're talking about, where that little one is stuck in the maze and they don't move. They just keep waiting for the cheese to come back, and the other one heads off and changes and pivots quickly and adapts.
There's another book that was written by the founder of Intel called Only the Paranoid Survive.
Oh, yes.
That's I think that's what's going on right now in the nutrition industry. And if you're not paranoid, you better watch your back, because new innovation is going to catch up.
I love that, mate. Hey, a couple of quick questions before we let you go, because you've been absolutely wonderful. But I'm always fascinated, now where you are in your life. What would you tell your 18-year-old self, if you could?
Keep frontiering, stay curious, use more sunblock, and marry the same girl.
Oh, I love that. That's very sweet. I love it. All right, and then another favorite question I have is 3 people you'd want to have dinner with, non-family, living or dead.
I think I talk. You've talked to frontiering. So for me, I would just love to sit down with Neil Armstrong and just talk about that time when he stepped off. I think, from a principles perspective and where she stood and the period of time she stood, I think Queen Elizabeth, I would love to have dinner with her.
Yeah.
And then I've always read a lot about Walt Disney, and I had the fortune of visiting Bhutan, and Disney tried to create the happiest place on earth, and the 4th Bhutanese king, he actually threw out gross domestic profit in exchange for gross national happiness index. And I would love to bring them both together in dinner and say, what do you now think is, the answer to happiness? Because these two had a real vision of what happiness is all about. I'd love to be in the middle of a debate with those two.
What a great dinner. What a great dinner. I'm sitting here going, wow, you've actually thought this through. I really like that. The Queen Elizabeth has been brought up numerous times.
Is that right? Interesting.
Yeah, I think, it was one of those shows, I don't know if you watched the series The Crown, but I think that was fascinating in itself. Both my wife and I wouldn't have minded hanging out with her a bit just to know that whole thing.
And the corgis.
And mate, where do you see yourself, in SFuels in 3 to 5 years' time? You've got a lot on your plate. Where do you envisage the company and what are your hopes?
Yeah, I feel like we've had just a lot of blessing, and Korea has been fantastic. The companies we've worked for and the countries we've been in, I feel like I still got a lot more to give. I just want to, stay curious and passionate. I feel like the market needs something like this. And honestly, if we are the rabbit that helps ultimately get something out there that fulfills the gap, we've done our job. If it's SFuels, awesome. If it's not, we've still done our job, because we need to move the market, and it's important.
I love it, buddy. And you got any racing coming up yourself, training, racing? You doing any events at the moment? Yeah? What are you up to?
My youngest son has not done a marathon. He's 16, hasn't done a marathon yet. And we're going to Switzerland. They have the UTMB now have this World Series, and there's a race there that is in Switzerland that has about 3,000 meters of climbing. And the scenery is just magic, right? So I've just told him, forget the concept of running. This is going to be a big day out.
Yeah.
And we're just going to lap it up and spend the day together. And we're doing a ton of training, but, again, it's just that experience of doing it together.
Oh, I love that. Whereabouts in Switzerland is that one?
It takes off and finishes in Verbier, which is just not far from Chamonix.
Yeah. I know that whole area pretty well. I did a lot of training there for many years.
All right.
Yeah, I did some, I remember doing running races around that area, which were just 10K straight up. I remember
it's up and down.
My coach at the time said, Greg, there's a 10K running race. Go down to the valley and sign up and do it tomorrow morning. I was like, oh, yeah. I turned up and I went and looked at the map profile. I'm like, what? We're basically walking with our hands on our knees for most of it. And then it was brutal.
The scenery is magic, huh? Yeah. It's just such an experience.
It's so great. Yeah. Well, Leighton, mate, thanks for coming on and sharing your story, your journey, and obviously everything you're doing with SFuels. I think it's wonderful. It's obviously, a lot of these things can be scary, but you've jumped in with 2 feet and you're giving it a really good crack. For everybody listening, please go check out SFuels. You've got so much wonderful content there to learn from, but also people can shop and buy your product. And it's direct around the world, or where do you ship to?
Yeah, we have direct everywhere around the world, but then Australia, New Zealand has distribution, Singapore has distribution, where because of the whole UK, EU situation, we're reevaluating how we do Europe. And then part of Bob and some of the team he's brought on with SFuels, they're helping on national distribution here in the US in the context of like brick and mortar retail, sports special.
Great. Oh, congrats again, mate. Congrats on all of it. I'm glad we got together here and had this really great chat.
It's great to chat, Greg. Yeah. It's always, you're one of those names where, again, you grow up and you hear and you watch and you look at the magazines, but you never get to meet. So it's a real buzz just to meet. Yeah,
this has been a real pleasure, buddy. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Everybody listening, you can find all the show notes and timestamps and everything else at bennettendurance.com/media.
Thanks a lot for listening. If you enjoyed the show, your support would truly be appreciated. You can visit the Patreon page, or you can subscribe with your podcast app of choice. Don't miss the next episode, so subscribe and be notified. For show notes, if you want to know more, please visit bennettendurance.com. I'm Phil Liggett, and on behalf of Greg Bennett, here's to the next time, and I hope you will join Greg again very soon.